Imagine a vast and silent landscape. The wind drifts gently across open plains, rattling dry grasses that have grown where once stood busy streets and sturdy wooden buildings. There are no footsteps here now, no laughter spilling from a saloon doorway, no wagon wheels creaking along a dusty path. Instead, there is only stillness, broken only by the occasional bird in flight or the distant sigh of the breeze. This quiet emptiness may seem timeless, as though it has always been here. Yet if we could turn back the clock just a century or two, we would see something very different. Frontier towns alive with human ambition, built with sweat and determination, and filled with hope for a brighter future. This story is not about bustling cities that became great centers of commerce, nor about famous capitals that are written into every history book. Rather, it is about the quieter places, the towns that bloomed briefly on the far reaches of the frontier, only to fade into obscurity. They were outposts of courage and imagination, settlements created in distant corners of wilderness, often clinging to survival against overwhelming odds. Many thrived for a short while, a handful left behind legends. But most were slowly erased, leaving only fragments, a broken stone foundation hidden under weeds, a photograph in a family album, or the faint outline of a forgotten street beneath the soil. As we begin our journey into these vanished towns, let us settle into a slower rhythm. This is not the tale of battles or great political upheaval. Instead, it is a softer kind of history, a reflection on places that once mattered deeply to those who lived there, but which have now become part of the earth again. To listen to their stories is to drift between memory and silence, where the human desire to belong meets the reality of time's passing hand. The frontier itself has always been both a promise and a test. For settlers, it offered opportunity, new land, new trade, new beginnings far from crowded cities. Yet it also demanded sacrifice. Harsh winters, poor harvests, isolation and fragile economies meant that many communities balanced precariously between survival and abandonment. When they failed, they did so quietly, without the noise of collapse that accompanies great civilizations. Instead, families simply moved on, leaving buildings to weather and decay until the wilderness reclaimed them. In this documentary, we will walk gently through the history of these towns that time erased. Each section will take us deeper into their story. First, we will reflect on why people sought out the frontier in the first place, what drew them across rivers, mountains, and deserts into remote places where so little was certain. Then we will step into their daily lives, noticing the rhythm of work and rest, the building of homes and shops, and the creation of fragile communities bound by necessity. From there, we will examine the challenges they faced, the harsh environment, the fragile economies built on single resources, and the constant tension between ambition and survival. We will visit mining camps that once glittered with the promise of gold, logging outposts that buzzed with sawmills, and railroad towns that depended on the passing of trains. And then we will watch as silence gradually returned, as nature crept back in, and as memory began to blur what once seemed so permanent. The purpose of this story is not to shock or surprise, but to offer perspective. History is not only about those who succeeded, it is also about those who tried, those who built, those who believed, and those whose efforts have since faded away. There is a strange comfort in remembering them. Their stories remind us that life is both fragile and enduring, fragile because towns can vanish within a generation, yet enduring because the human spirit continues to dream, to build, and to seek out new horizons. So as you listen, imagine yourself walking slowly through these forgotten places. Perhaps you see a weathered wooden sign lying in the grass, or the stone remains of a chimney standing alone where a home once stood. Perhaps you hear only the hush of the wind, but faintly in your mind you can picture the sound of voices that once filled the air. In this gentle space between history and memory, we find the quiet beauty of towns that no longer exist, yet still live on in story. This is our beginning, a calm exploration, not of power or glory, but of persistence and impermanence. By the end, we will have traced a journey across landscapes where ambition once burned brightly, only to be extinguished by time. And in that reflection, perhaps we will discover something about ourselves, that even when places vanish, the echo of human hope continues to linger, waiting for us to remember. When we think of the frontier, we often imagine wide open horizons, endless skies, and the promise of something new just beyond the next ridge. For those who lived in the 19th century, The idea of the frontier was more than just a dream, it was a living possibility. Cities along the eastern seaboard were crowded and expensive. Opportunities were often reserved for the wealthy or well-connected. But the frontier? The frontier whispered to everyone, offering land, freedom, and the chance to shape one's destiny with their own hands. It is difficult for us today, surrounded by modern convenience, to imagine the allure such promises held. For a struggling family, the idea of owning a patch of land that no one else had claimed, land where a farm could rise, and where children could grow with space to roam, was powerful. For others, the lure came from resources hidden in the earth, veins of gold or silver, deposits of copper or coal, or forests thick with tall timber waiting to be cut and shipped east. Every whispered rumor of discovery sent waves of settlers chasing opportunity, convinced that fortune might lie just a few days' journey away. The frontier also represented escape. For some it was freedom from debt, from old mistakes, or from the rigid class divisions that weighed heavily in older towns. Moving west, or into the wilderness of untamed land, was a chance to begin again with a clean slate. One could be judged not by their family name or social standing, but by their ability to endure, to build, and to contribute. In this way, the frontier offered something more than material gain. It offered dignity. Imagine for a moment a family loading their belongings into a creaking wooden wagon. The father guides the oxen forward, while the mother balances a child on her lap and looks back one last time at the town they are leaving. Every possession they bring with them must be chosen carefully: tools for building, seeds for planting, and a few treasured items to remind them of the life left behind. Ahead of them lies uncertainty, perhaps weeks of travel, unpredictable weather, and the constant question of whether they will find what they seek. Yet despite the risk, they go forward, carried by the promise that the frontier will reward their courage. The lure was not only for families. Many who traveled into the frontier were young men chasing stories of gold strikes or railroad jobs. Some hoped to open saloons or trading posts, certain that wherever miners gathered, business would follow. Others became scouts, hunters, or guides, trading knowledge of the land for survival. Each had their own reason, but all shared the belief that the frontier was a place of endless possibility, if only one was bold enough to claim it. Governments encouraged this movement as well. New settlements meant expanding borders, securing resources, and building a sense of national strength. Land acts and homestead laws promised free or inexpensive plots to anyone willing to cultivate them. Railroads stretched further and further, carrying settlers into places that had once seemed unreachable. Posters and pamphlets painted the frontier in glowing terms: fertile soil, rich resources, and a better tomorrow waiting just beyond the horizon. Of course, the reality was often far more difficult than the dream, but in this section we linger on the hope that drew people in the first place. Without that hope, towns would never have been founded. Hope was the seed from which every cabin, every street, and every community first grew. Even when settlers faced bitter cold or searing drought, it was the memory of what they sought, the lure of independence and prosperity, that kept them trying, at least for a while. To understand why these towns existed at all, we must recognize that they were born from longing. Longing for land, longing for wealth, longing for freedom from the limitations of old lives. The frontier was not just a place, it was an idea that life could be remade, that the future was not fixed, and that somewhere out there was a patch of earth where one could belong. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it: a newly founded town in the middle of wilderness. The streets are rough, more dirt than road. The houses are freshly built, the smell of cut timber still hanging in the air. Lanterns glow faintly from windows, casting soft light into the darkness. Neighbors gather, sharing stories of where they came from and what they hope to build. The town has no past, only a present filled with energy, and a future that seems wide open. This is the spirit of the frontier, the lure that brought strangers together to carve out lives in places the wider world had forgotten. Not every dreamer who came found success. Many did not. Yet the fact that so many tried is what gives these lost towns their bittersweet beauty. Behind each ruined foundation or crumbling wall lies the story of someone who believed in possibility, someone who looked at a stretch of wilderness and saw not emptiness but a home. As we move forward, we will explore what happened when these dreams met the reality of frontier life. We will see how families built, how they endured, and how, in the end, many towns were unable to hold against the challenges around them. But before we reflect on their struggles, we pause here, in this moment of beginning, when hope was still unbroken, and the future still seemed as vast as the horizon itself. The dream of the frontier, once chosen, quickly became the work of daily survival. Arriving in a new place was only the beginning. A patch of wilderness might hold promise, but it offered nothing freely. Settlers had to build from the ground up every part of the community they hoped would last. In this, we see the true heart of frontier towns, not just the ambition that brought people there, but the determination to turn empty land into a home. Imagine the first days of a settlement. Wagons are pulled to a halt near a river bend or on the edge of a meadow. People step down, stretch their weary limbs, and begin to unload what little they own. There are no streets, no shops, and no houses waiting for them. The world around is raw, grass waving in the breeze, trees standing tall, and perhaps the faint tracks of animals crossing the soil. For the settlers, this is the blank canvas upon which they will try to paint a life. The first task is shelter. Rough cabins go up quickly, built from nearby logs, if the land provides them, or from sod cut from the earth itself, when wood is scarce. These early homes are small, often just 1 or 2 rooms, with a fireplace at the center to keep out the cold. The walls may leak, the roof may sag, but within those walls a family can rest, cook, and find safety from the elements. By night, lanterns glow faintly through tiny windows, marking the presence of human life in the vastness of the land. Next comes the work of community. A single family can survive for a time, but a town requires cooperation. One neighbor may know how to cut timber, another may be skilled at blacksmithing, while someone else might have brought seeds for crops. Slowly, out of necessity, a division of roles takes shape. The general store becomes the center for trade, even if at first it is little more than a tent stocked with flour, nails, and cloth. A blacksmith sets up a forge, where sparks rise into the twilight, as tools are repaired and wagon wheels are mended. In time, a saloon appears, serving as both a place of rest and a social gathering point. And somewhere nearby, a small church is raised, offering not just spiritual guidance, but also a sense of stability and belonging. Life in these early towns is marked by rhythm. At sunrise, the sounds of axes, hammers, and livestock begin. Men and women labor in fields or workshops, while children carry water, tend animals, or help gather firewood. By midday, dust rises from wagon wheels along the rough paths, as travelers arrive with news, supplies, or letters from distant homes. As evening falls, lanterns light the windows of cabins, and voices carry across the settlement, soft conversations, songs, or laughter breaking through the stillness. Yet, even as towns grew, they remained fragile. A single failed harvest could bring hunger. A harsh winter might trap families indoors, depleting their stores. Illness could sweep through, with little medicine to fight it, and isolation weighed heavily. Letters might take months to arrive, and many settlers lived, knowing they might never see their old homes or distant relatives again. The sense of community was not just practical, it was essential for the survival of spirit. What gave these towns their unique character was not only the work done during the day, but also the hope shared in quiet moments. Picture neighbors gathering around a fire after the day's labor, speaking softly of their plans. One dreams of planting orchards, another of expanding a modest shop into something larger, while another dreams of building a schoolhouse so their children can read and write. These conversations, spoken under the stars, carried with them the belief that what they were doing mattered, that they were shaping something lasting, something greater than themselves. Small touches made even the roughest towns feel alive. A wooden sign carefully carved above a store door, curtains sewn from scraps of fabric hanging in cabin windows, flowers planted near a doorway. These little efforts spoke of a desire not only to survive, but to thrive, to bring comfort and dignity into places that were otherwise harsh and uncertain. The sounds of these towns, too, were distinct. The clatter of hooves on dirt streets, the ring of a hammer striking an anvil, the laughter of children splashing in a creek, the creak of wooden wagons, the call of merchants, the strains of a fiddle playing at night in the saloon. Today, these sounds are gone, but when we imagine them, we can sense the vibrancy of towns that for a moment in time pulsed with human life. Still, the work never truly ended. To live on the frontier was to face constant tasks, mending roofs, chopping firewood, hauling water, and preparing for the next season. Even leisure was brief, stolen between chores, but there was pride in this work. Pride in knowing that every beam raised, every field planted, and every path cleared was the result of one's own hands. The building of frontier towns was, in truth, the building of hope made visible. Each cabin, each shop, each road was a declaration: we are here, and we will endure. And though many of these towns would eventually fade, in their beginnings they carried a strength that is both humbling and inspiring. As we leave this section, imagine yourself walking slowly down the main street of one such town in its earliest days. Dust rises gently under your feet. To your left, a carpenter is hammering planks into place. To your right, a woman tends a small garden beside her cabin. Ahead, a group of children chase one another, their laughter filling the air. The buildings are simple, the comforts are few, but the spirit is strong. Here, on the edge of wilderness, life has been coaxed into being from nothing. This was the foundation. From these humble beginnings, communities grew, and as they grew, so too did the challenges they faced, challenges that would determine whether they survived or slowly slipped away. The frontier may have seemed full of promise, but for those who settled there, the land itself was often the greatest challenge. Every town that rose from the wilderness had to wrestle with the environment, and though human effort was determined, the forces of nature were unrelenting. The wilderness offered opportunity, yes, but it also tested patience, strength, and spirit in ways that many did not expect. Picture a town in the heart of winter. Snow falls thickly, blanketing cabins and covering the dirt streets until they vanish beneath a heavy white silence. The river that once brought fresh water is frozen, forcing settlers to hack through ice with axes just to fill their buckets. Supply wagons cannot reach the settlement, trapped miles away by drifts and storms. Inside the cabins, families huddle close to fires, counting carefully the logs they have left, rationing their food supplies to last until spring. Every howl of the wind reminds them of how fragile their situation is. Now imagine the opposite: summer heat baking the earth until the soil cracks. Crops planted with such hope wither before they can be harvested. Wells run dry, and cattle stagger weakly in the fields. Families rise each morning to scan the sky for clouds, desperate for rain that never comes. The sound of a distant thunderclap brings momentary relief, only to fade into nothingness as the sun continues its unbroken reign. For a frontier town, a single season of drought could mean abandonment, forcing families to leave behind everything they built. Floods, too, brought devastation. Rivers that once served as lifelines could suddenly swell beyond their banks, tearing away fences, barns, and even entire streets. Settlers who had built close to the water for convenience found themselves at the mercy of its power. In the aftermath, towns were left coated in mud, supplies ruined, and spirits shaken. Where once there had been order, there was only ruin. The environment tested settlers not just through weather, but through isolation. Many of these towns were founded miles away from established cities, or even neighboring communities. A journey to the nearest town might take days across rough, unpredictable terrain. When storms cut off travel, or illness struck, families often had no choice but to endure alone. This isolation could be as punishing as the elements themselves, a reminder that the frontier was not easily tamed. Wildlife, too, presented its own challenges. Bears roamed the forests, wolves prowled the edges of settlements, and smaller creatures threatened food supplies stored in cabins or barns. Fences had to be repaired constantly, livestock guarded carefully, and families lived with the knowledge that nature was never far from their doorstep. In some places, swarms of insects darkened the skies, descending upon fields and leaving devastation in their wake. Each season carried its own risks, and the settlers could never let down their guard. The land itself, for all its beauty, often resisted cultivation. Rocky soil made planting difficult, while dense forests required endless hours of labor just to clear enough space for fields. Even in regions where crops thrived, the work was grueling, plowing by hand or with animals, sowing seed and praying the weather would not undo the effort. Many who had come with dreams of fertile land discovered quickly that the earth demanded more of them than they ever imagined. Yet even in the face of these hardships, people endured. They patched roofs that the wind tore away, they replanted fields destroyed by frost, and they rebuilt after floods. There was a rhythm to this resilience. Each disaster was followed by recovery, each setback met with determination, but the cost of such constant struggle wore on towns. Not all could survive repeated blows. One family might leave after a second harsh winter, another might depart after losing their crops twice in a row. Slowly, without dramatic collapse, a town could thin out, house by house, until silence replaced the sounds of daily life. Consider for a moment what it must have felt like to watch a town fade. At first, perhaps, only a single family left. Their cabin sat empty, its windows dark. Then another followed, unable to withstand another failed harvest. Soon gaps appeared along the main street, where once neighbors had waved to one another. Each departure weakened the community's chance of survival, until at last the town itself seemed to give up. The wilderness, ever patient, reclaimed what had once been claimed by human hands. And yet, for all its harshness, the environment also held beauty that kept settlers rooted. Sunrise over the prairie painted the sky in endless shades of gold and crimson. The forests, though demanding, offered timber, game, and moments of peace among towering trees. Rivers glimmered in the evening light, their waters carrying both challenge and life. For many, this beauty balanced the hardships, reminding them of why they had come in the first place. The environment then was both adversary and companion. It demanded much, but it also gave moments of wonder, nights when stars stretched endlessly above, mornings when the mist lifted slowly from the land, afternoons when the sound of wind through the grass was the only music a settler might hear. These moments, quiet and profound, gave people strength to continue. Still, the truth remains, the frontier was unforgiving. The harsh environment shaped every aspect of life, from the design of cabins to the size of harvests, from the rhythm of work to the survival of entire towns. It was this constant struggle between human ambition and natural force that determined which communities endured and which faded into memory. As we leave this section, picture again a small town on the edge of wilderness. The cabins are sturdy but weathered, the streets dusty or muddy depending on the season. Families labor each day, their faces lined with both determination and fatigue. They have built much, but they live at the mercy of the land, knowing that one storm, one drought, or one harsh winter could decide their fate. The environment gave the frontier its character, and it also dictated its limits. And as we continue, we will see how these natural hardships were joined by another challenge, one that proved just as destructive. Beyond storms and droughts, towns faced another kind of fragility, the fragility of their economies. When resources dwindled or industries failed, even the strongest communities found themselves standing on uncertain ground. While the frontier's harsh environment tested the body and spirit, another force shaped the fate of towns just as deeply: the economy. If weather could strip away crops or flood streets, money, or the lack of it, could quietly undo years of effort. Frontier towns were often born of opportunity, tied closely to a single resource or industry. But just as quickly as opportunity arrived, it could vanish, leaving behind streets that grew empty and businesses that fell silent. In many cases, towns sprang up overnight, around discoveries of precious metals. A rumor of gold or silver was enough to draw hundreds of hopeful miners, each bringing with them not only pickaxes and pans, but also the need for food, shelter, and supplies. General stores and saloons opened, boarding houses were built, and merchants filled wagons with goods to sell at inflated prices. For a time, money flowed easily, but mining booms rarely lasted. Once the richest veins were exhausted, miners packed their tools and moved on to the next strike. Businesses that had thrived suddenly found themselves with no customers. Streets that had been crowded one year stood deserted the next. Logging towns faced a similar pattern. A dense forest might give rise to sawmills, timber yards, and a network of workers' homes. For a while, wagons loaded with lumber rolled steadily out of town, bringing prosperity. Yet forests could be stripped quickly, leaving barren hillsides and little reason for the settlement to remain. When the last tree fell, so too did the town's purpose. What was once a bustling center of trade became a scattering of abandoned buildings, gradually reclaimed by the land. Railroads too created fragile economies. A single stop along a new line could transform a lonely stretch of prairie into a thriving town. Merchants set up shops, farmers brought their goods to market, and hotels welcomed weary travelers. But if the railroad shifted its route, or if a larger town down the line grew more important, smaller stops often withered. A depot that had once been the beating heart of a community could be closed in an instant, leaving families with no reason to stay. For frontier towns, the lack of economic diversity was often their undoing. Most relied heavily on one source of income, a mine, a mill, or a trade route. Few had the chance to develop broader foundations, schools, industries, or markets that might have given them resilience. When that single lifeline faltered, the entire community was left vulnerable. Even for those towns not tied to a single resource, survival was a delicate balance. The cost of goods was high, as everything not produced locally had to be hauled in by wagon or train. A barrel of flour, a coil of rope, or a single tool could cost far more than it did in established cities. Merchants charged what the market would bear, but if times grew lean and families could not pay, businesses failed. Credit was extended cautiously, and debt could cripple both shopkeepers and customers alike. Consider the role of the general store. More than just a place to purchase goods, it was often the hub of frontier life. Farmers brought eggs, milk, or handmade items to trade for flour or coffee. News passed through its doors, as did letters and announcements. Yet if crops failed or if families left town, the store quickly became unsustainable. Shelves emptied, not because goods were sold, but because there was no money to replace them. A boarded-up store was often the first sign that a town was beginning to die. Saloons, too, rose and fell with the fortunes of their patrons. In times of prosperity, they rang with laughter, music, and the clink of glasses. Miners spent freely, loggers celebrated the end of long days, and railroad workers gathered to share stories. But when wages stopped flowing, saloons grew quiet. An empty saloon meant more than a lack of merriment. It meant the lifeblood of the town was slipping away. Banks, when they existed, carried even greater risks. Without strong oversight, some collapsed overnight, taking with them the savings of entire communities. When trust in the local economy vanished, so too did the hope of stability. Families, unwilling to gamble their futures, packed up and moved on to safer ground. Despite these fragilities, there was always a sense of optimism at the beginning. Settlers believed that if they worked hard, if they endured, prosperity would follow. And sometimes for a brief while it did. A new mine produced silver that glittered in the sunlight, a forest echoed with the steady chop of axes, a depot bustled with arrivals and departures. But prosperity was fleeting. Few towns had the foundations to withstand the sudden shifts of fortune. Imagine walking through such a town during its decline. Storefronts that once displayed goods now have shutters drawn tight. A saloon door swings open with the wind, revealing a room filled only with dust. The train station, once crowded with travelers, stands silent, its benches empty. The silence is not dramatic but gradual, a slow fading of energy as opportunity moved elsewhere. These fragile economies remind us of how dependent frontier life was on forces beyond the settlers' control. A new strike of ore in a neighboring valley, the exhaustion of a forest, or a shift in railroad lines could decide the fate of hundreds. Even the hardest working families, the most determined entrepreneurs, could not always fight against economic tides that turned without warning. And so towns that had once seemed full of promise became places of memory. Their buildings remained, their signs weathered but legible, their streets overgrown with grass. But the commerce that had given them purpose was gone. Without it, survival was impossible. In this way, the frontier was both generous and cruel. It gave opportunities that seemed boundless, yet it took them away just as easily. For every town that managed to adapt and grow, many more withered when their fragile economies collapsed. What remains today are the echoes: an abandoned storefront, a rusting sawmill, a forgotten mine shaft, all silent witnesses to the rise and fall of fragile dreams. As we move forward, we will focus on one of the clearest examples of this cycle, the mining towns. These were places that grew in days, filled with excitement and ambition, only to vanish almost as quickly when the earth refused to give more. In their silence today, we hear both the echo of ambition and the inevitability of decline. If there was one force above all others that drew people deep into the frontier, it was the promise of precious metals. The discovery of gold or silver could turn a lonely hillside into the center of a bustling town almost overnight. Camps sprang up where days before there had been only wilderness. Isunda spores, Innes in Saith Shim Says smoke rose events, Huns pools, and near, halls, 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 halls,
holes, 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 holes.
Men with picks and shovels rushed in. Merchants followed with wagons full of supplies, and within weeks streets echoed with the sounds of hammers, saws, and human voices. The lure of gold and silver was irresistible. Newspapers carried stories of great strikes, fueling imaginations with tales of fortunes won in a single afternoon. In reality, most who came found only backbreaking labor and disappointment, for the possibility of sudden wealth was enough. It pulled thousands across rivers, mountains, and deserts into places where nothing else could have persuaded them to go. Mining towns were fragile by nature because they were tied to a single resource. Yet, in their short lives, they burned brightly. Picture one in its early days: tents clustered on a hillside, smoke rising from campfires, the clang of metal against stone carrying across the valley. Soon the tents give way to wooden cabins, rough saloons, and general stores. A main street emerges, lined with false front buildings, giving the impression of permanence even as the town's future is uncertain. By night, lanterns glow in the windows and the sound of fiddles and laughter drifts from the saloon. There is an energy in the air, a sense that fortunes are being made and lives transformed. But beneath this energy was always the shadow of decline. Mines were rich at first, yielding nuggets of gold or thick veins of silver. Prospectors staked claims and dug shafts deep into the earth. Wagons hauled out ore by the ton, feeding smelters and filling the pockets of a lucky few. Yet every strike was finite. What glittered in the beginning grew thin with time. Shafts went deeper, work grew harder, and yields diminished. What had been easy pickings turned into grueling labor for smaller and smaller reward. As the ore dwindled, so too did the people. Merchants who had charged high prices for flour, boots, or mining tools found fewer customers. Boarding houses emptied, saloons grew quiet. Those who had arrived with dreams of riches packed their belongings and moved on to the next rumored strike, leaving behind buildings that quickly fell into silence. Some towns lingered longer than others, managing to diversify with ranching, farming, or small trade, but many did not. When the mines closed, the towns closed with them. Streets that once bustled with energy became deserted. Saloons stood empty, their bars gathering dust. Storefronts remained, but their windows stared blankly onto roads no one traveled. The skeletons of mining equipment rusted in the open air, silent reminders of the frenzy that had once filled the place. Walking through such a town today is like stepping into a ghost's memory. Wooden buildings lean at precarious angles, their paint long since peeled away. Wind whistles through broken shutters. Mine shafts gape like dark mouths in the earth, fenced off for safety but still holding the scent of dust and stone. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the voices: miners calling to one another, merchants calling out their goods, music spilling into the street. But when you open them again, there is only silence. One of the most striking features of these ghost towns is the contrast between their short lives and their enduring remains. A city that lasted for centuries might leave behind ruins of stone, but many mining towns survived for only a decade or two. Still, in that brief time, they left behind stories, artifacts, and a haunting sense of ambition cut short. A schoolhouse built with hope might stand empty after only a few years. A church where hymns once rose might echo now only with the sound of the wind. The human stories behind these places add to their poignancy. Families followed miners into these towns, bringing children, teachers, and ministers. For a time they built real communities, schools, dances, newspapers, even theaters. They hoped their towns might outlast the mines, that they might become permanent places on the map. For some, those dreams were realized in small ways. But for many, the decline of the mine meant the unraveling of all else. Families left, businesses closed, and what remained was swallowed by time. The cycle repeated again and again across the frontier. From the California gold rush to silver strikes in Nevada, from copper booms in Montana to coal camps in Colorado, the story was familiar: arrival, growth, prosperity, decline, and silence. Each town believed for a moment that it would be the exception, that its wealth would last, that its people would stay. Few did. Today, these ghost towns stand as reminders of both ambition and impermanence. Tourists may wander their streets, marveling at weathered storefronts and collapsing mine shafts. Historians may trace the records of who lived there, who thrived, and who moved on. But beyond the facts and figures lies a deeper truth. These towns capture the restless spirit of their time. They embody the hope that drove people to risk everything, the determination to carve out life in impossible places, and the inevitability of decline when dreams ran dry. To reflect on them is not to mourn their loss, but to appreciate their existence. Even in their brevity, they tell us something profound about human nature. We are drawn to possibility, even when it is fleeting. We build even when we know what we build may not last. We pursue dreams even when they carry us to places that time itself may erase. So as we walk the silent streets of these ghost towns in our imagination, let us listen closely, not just to the absence, but to the echo of what was once there, the laughter, the struggle, the ambition, the fleeting joy of a lucky strike. These echoes remind us that history is not only measured in centuries but also in moments, moments when hope burned brightly, even if only for a short while. And from here, our story turns outward again. Mining towns were only one piece of the larger frontier puzzle. Beyond them lay countless other communities, farming villages, railroad stops, logging camps, each shaped by the same forces of hope and hardship. Many are gone now, lost to memory. But together, they remind us of the fragile nature of settlement, and the way time erases even the most determined efforts. Not every forgotten town was born in the frenzy of gold or silver. Many rose in quieter ways rooted in farming, trade, or the steady rhythm of everyday life. These were not places of sudden fortune or feverish crowds, but small communities built on hope, work, and the belief that simple stability might endure where wild ambition often failed. And yet, in the end, time touched them just as surely. Picture a modest settlement on the open prairie. Instead of saloons and mine shafts, there are barns and windmills. Instead of tents that spring up overnight, there are carefully built houses, each with a small garden, a smokehouse, and fields stretching out in every direction. Life here was different, shaped less by rapid growth, and more by seasons of planting and harvest. Farming towns were the quiet heart of the frontier. Families worked the land together, rising with the sun, tending livestock, and marking the year by the cycles of wheat, corn, or barley. Neighbors depended on one another for help, borrowing tools, sharing labor at harvest, gathering for barn raisings. A single general store might supply everything from flour to nails, while a blacksmith kept wagons rolling and plows sharp. There might be a one-room schoolhouse, a small church, and if the town grew, perhaps even a modest post office where letters arrived after long journeys. The rhythm was slower here, but no less fragile. Drought could wither crops, leaving barns empty and tables bare. Insects could sweep through fields, undoing months of labor in a matter of days. Harsh winters tested even the most prepared, while isolation wore heavily on the mind. Families lived miles apart, and for some, weeks could pass without seeing another face beyond their own household. Trade towns, too, dotted the frontier. Some were born along wagon routes serving as rest stops for travelers. Others grew beside rivers where goods could be ferried from one community to another. A few thrived at railroad junctions, briefly bustling as trains brought passengers and freight. These towns built to serve movement depended on it. When routes shifted, when a railroad laid its track a few miles farther away, or when a river port lost its importance, these towns dwindled. Stores closed, inns emptied, and the roads that once carried wagons became quiet stretches of dust. Some of the most poignant of these lost places were communities founded with specific visions. Religious groups often sought to create utopias in the wilderness, hoping to build a perfect society apart from the rest of the world. For a time, these towns thrived, guided by shared belief and a sense of purpose. But idealism often collided with reality. Disagreements, hardship, or the sheer difficulty of survival eroded them, and one by one they faded, leaving behind only scattered foundations and records in old journals. What makes these towns especially haunting is that they were never meant to burn brightly and vanish quickly, like mining camps. They were meant to last. They were born from long-term hope, from the dream of permanence. Families planted orchards expecting to see them bear fruit for generations. Schoolhouses were built not just for children today, but for grandchildren tomorrow. Churches were raised with the belief that hymns would echo through them for decades to come, and yet, for so many, time told a different story. Walk through the remains of such a town today, and the sense of absence is profound. A foundation hidden in tall grass, a lone chimney standing where a house once was, perhaps a faded gravestone, half swallowed by weeds, marking the resting place of someone who once believed this land would be home forever. There are fewer dramatic ruins than in mining towns, but perhaps more quiet sorrow. For here it is not only fortune that was lost, but continuity, dreams of families, futures and rootedness. And yet, as with all forgotten towns, there is beauty in what remains. Nature has returned to reclaim what people left behind. Prairie grasses sway where streets once lay. Birds nest in rafters of barns long abandoned. Wildflowers bloom where gardens were once carefully tended. In their silence, these places remind us of the cycles of time, that what is built by human hands may one day return to the earth, but not without leaving an imprint on memory. The stories of these communities may not fill the headlines of history, but they matter deeply. They tell us of ordinary lives, lived with quiet determination, of children who played in fields now empty, of families who gathered at tables, said grace, and worked together from dawn until dusk. These details, though small, are the threads of history as much as battles, inventions, or great discoveries. If we listen carefully, the forgotten farming towns and trading posts of the frontier whisper something timeless, that the effort to build a home, however modest, is one of the most enduring expressions of hope. Even when the buildings fall and the names fade from maps, the spirit of those who tried remains. From here our journey through forgotten towns begins to gather toward its conclusion. We have seen how mining camps burned brightly and died quickly, and how farming villages and trade towns faded quietly into the landscape. Each in their own way reveals the impermanence of human endeavor, and the way time, in its slow and steady passage, erases without malice, but also without pause. As we walk quietly through the memories of forgotten towns, a question rises like a whisper in the back of the mind. Why do they vanish? How does a place that once held laughter, work, and daily life fall silent, leaving only fragments behind? The answers are many, and they are woven together by time, chance, and the relentless march of change. One of the most common reasons is geography itself. Many towns were founded in places that seemed promising but proved unsustainable. A river might flood too often, washing away fields and homes. A dry season might reveal that wells were not deep enough, leaving families without water. Harsh winters might make life unbearable, driving people to seek gentler climates. The land that seemed welcoming in one season might, in another, reveal its hidden difficulties. Economics, too, played its part. Towns tied to a single industry, whether mining, lumber, or trade, lived and died by the fortunes of that industry. When the gold ran out, the silver veins thinned, or the forests were cut bare, the reason for the town's existence vanished. Businesses closed, people left, and the streets emptied. A settlement might adapt if it could, shifting from mining to farming, or from timber to trade, but many could not. They had been built on a single dream, and when the dream ended, so did the town. Technology also redrew the map. The railroad in particular acted like a lifeline. Towns blessed with a station thrived, receiving goods, visitors, and communication from the wider world. But if the tracks were laid just a few miles away, bypassing a town, its fate was sealed. Inns and stores lost their customers, farmers struggled to sell their crops, and families slowly drifted away. Later, as automobiles and highways spread, the pattern repeated. Some towns found themselves connected, others were left stranded, ghosts along roads no one traveled. Politics and policy shaped destinies as well. Land grants encouraged some communities, while the withdrawal of support left others vulnerable. Native lands forcibly taken often created tension, violence, or displacement, with settlements abandoned after conflict. Changes in county borders or state priorities could also shift resources, leaving certain towns neglected. A mapmaker's decision, a legislator's vote, could determine whether a town lived or faded. Disease and disaster also carried towns into silence. Epidemics swept through frontier settlements with little resistance. Smallpox, influenza, and other illnesses could devastate a population in weeks, leaving homes empty and fields untended. Fires, too, claimed many towns. Built of wood and often lacking organized firefighting, A single spark could consume entire streets. Floods, tornadoes, and earthquakes added their hand to the work of erasure. For families who survived, the loss of homes and livelihoods often meant moving elsewhere, leaving behind charred foundations and broken walls. But sometimes disappearance came more slowly, in the quiet erosion of purpose. A farming town might endure for decades before the soil grew thin and unyielding. Young people seeking opportunity left for cities, families aged, houses fell empty, and schools closed for lack of children. No single event marked the end, only the gradual dimming of life until silence settled in. There is also something larger, something almost inevitable, in the way time shifts human settlement. We are creatures of movement. We seek new opportunities, new beginnings, new promises. The frontier drew people forward, and as they moved on, they left behind footprints in the form of towns. Some footprints endure, others fade, erased by wind, rain, and grass. It is not always failure. Sometimes it is simply change, the turning of one chapter into another. When we consider why towns disappear, we are reminded of the delicate balance of human life. It takes so much to sustain a community: food, water, shelter, trade, safety, connection. Remove one element, and the structure falters. Remove more, and it collapses. What we see today, in the remains of ghost towns and forgotten villages, is not only loss but also testimony to how much effort it takes to create and maintain a place where life can flourish. And yet, in their disappearance, these towns also give us perspective. They remind us that permanence is an illusion. Even the busiest streets, the brightest lights, the most hopeful dreams may in time fall quiet. Cities we know today may one day fade, just as those frontier settlements did. The difference is not in kind, but in scale and speed. To walk among their ruins then is to feel a strange mix of sorrow and peace. Sorrow because lives were uprooted and dreams dissolved. Peace because the silence they left behind has become part of the natural world again. Trees root in old streets. Grass waves where houses once stood. The cycle continues, indifferent yet gentle. So why do towns disappear? Because human ambition meets the limits of nature, economy, and time. Because change is constant, and nothing, no matter how solid, escapes it. The forgotten towns of the frontier are not exceptions, they are reminders. Reminders that all things, even the most hopeful, are temporary, and that within that impermanence lies both beauty and truth. As our story moves toward its final chapters, we carry these lessons with us. We have walked through towns built on gold and silver, through villages rooted in soil and trade, and now we see clearly the patterns that shaped their rise and fall. Ahead we turn to the present, how some of these ghost towns endure as relics, preserved or remembered, while others slip away entirely into the embrace of the earth. Though many frontier towns slipped into silence long ago, their echoes remain with us. Some stand in visible ruins, weathered boards, and empty streets still holding the outline of human life. Others survive only as names on old maps, their locations overgrown with grass reclaimed by forest or prairie. And yet, even in their disappearance, these towns are not entirely gone. They live on in memory, in history, and in the quiet presence of what they left behind. Walk today through a ghost town preserved for visitors and the past feels near. Wooden sidewalks creak underfoot. Sunlight spills through broken windows. Dust gathers thick on floors where once boots clattered and voices filled the air. Each building tells a fragment of the story: a store with empty shelves, a saloon where a bar still stands, a schoolhouse with chalk marks faintly lingering on its board. These places are fragile, yet they offer us the rare chance to step, however briefly, into another time. Some towns have been carefully preserved as historical sites. They serve as open-air museums, teaching us not only about architecture and artifacts but also about the human will to endure. Guides tell stories of the people who once lived there, their struggles, their hopes, and their eventual departure. Visitors move quietly, respectful of the silence, as though the walls themselves are listening. The preservation is more than practical. It is a way of honoring those who built lives in difficult places, only for time to sweep them away. Other ghost towns remain untouched, left to decay naturally. These are quieter, lonelier places. To find them, one may drive miles down gravel roads, hike through fields, or stumble upon them by chance. They feel less like museums and more like secrets whispered by the land itself. The wood leans, the nails rust, and the wind sighs through gaps where doors once hung. Standing there, one feels both the presence of those who lived and the weight of absence that followed. In many ways, these towns survive not just in their ruins but in the imagination. Writers, filmmakers, and storytellers return to them again and again, drawn by their haunting beauty. They become symbols of ambition, of impermanence, of the fleeting nature of human endeavor. A ghost town on screen or on a page is not merely a setting, it is a character in itself, carrying silence and memory as part of its very being. Tourism has also given some ghost towns a second life. Travelers seek them out, curious to walk among relics of the past. Saloons may reopen as attractions, hotels may host guests once more, though now with electricity and running water. Festivals celebrate old traditions with actors in period dress reenacting frontier days. For a weekend, the town breathes again, not as it once was but as a reflection, a living memory shaped by modern imagination. Yet there is something fragile in this revival too. For every ghost town preserved or revived, many more fade quietly with each passing year. Weather eats away at wooden beams, roofs collapse, foundations sink. Eventually, even the memory may vanish, as names are forgotten and places blend into the landscape. In this way, ghost towns remind us not only of the past but of the constant motion of history, that what is vivid today may be invisible tomorrow. And still, the echoes endure in subtler ways. They linger in family stories passed down from grandparents who once lived in these places. They remain in old photographs tucked into albums, in yellowed newspapers preserved in libraries, in the lines of letters written by settlers who described their days in detail. Even when the physical town is gone, the memory persists in words, in images, in the way history quietly anchors us to those who came before. Perhaps the most powerful echo, though, is in what these towns teach us about our own lives. Standing among their remains, we are reminded that all things are temporary. Even the busiest streets of today, the tallest buildings, the brightest lights, will one day fade. What feels permanent is, in truth, only a moment in time. Ghost towns embody this truth gently, without bitterness. They show us that impermanence is natural, that endings are part of the cycle, and that beauty can be found even in decline. In this way, forgotten frontier towns are not only stories of the past, they are mirrors for the present. They invite us to pause, to reflect, to consider what we build and why we build it. They ask us to remember that our lives too will leave traces, some lasting, some fleeting, all eventually softened by time. So when we speak of echoes in the present, we are not only speaking of old boards, rusted nails, or fading maps. We are speaking of memory itself, the way the past hums quietly beneath the surface of the world, waiting for us to listen. And as we move toward the end of our journey, we carry these echoes with us, a reminder of the towns that once were, the lives that once filled them, and the silence that remains. And so, as we come to the end of our journey through forgotten frontier towns, we are left with a lingering stillness, one that mirrors the silence of the places we have visited. We began with a dream, the restless push of men and women who sought to carve lives from untamed landscapes. We walk through towns born in frenzy and fortune, and through quieter communities built with patience and hope. We traced their rise, their struggles, and their eventual fading into memory. Now, as we step back, the larger picture comes into focus. What these towns reveal is not only history, but the nature of human endeavor itself. We build with hope. We dream of permanence. We plant orchards believing they will feed generations. We raise schools and churches believing children will walk their halls for centuries. And yet, so often, time has other plans. The mines emptied, the railroad shifted, the rivers dried, and the people moved on. What remains are echoes, timbers leaning in the wind, stones scattered in tall grass, and the stories we tell. There is a certain peace in this truth. To know that nothing is truly permanent is not to despair, but to recognize that impermanence is part of the rhythm of life. Just as seasons turn, just as day gives way to night, so too do towns, cities, and even civilizations come and go. The frontier towns remind us of this in the gentlest way possible, not through sudden endings, but through slow fading, until nature takes hold again, and life continues in another form. As we reflect, imagine once more walking down a dusty main street. The buildings are worn, the windows empty, the air quiet, and yet, With each step you feel the presence of those who once lived here, the blacksmith hammering at his forge, the children chasing one another in the sun, the shopkeeper arranging goods on his shelves. They are gone, but they are not entirely lost. For as long as we remember, as long as we tell their stories, a part of them endures. The lesson of these forgotten towns is not about failure, but about courage. To leave behind everything familiar and attempt to build a life in the unknown is an act of extraordinary bravery. Even when the towns did not last, the effort itself mattered. It shaped the land, it carried families forward, and it left behind traces that still speak to us today. In their silence there is dignity, in their emptiness there is still meaning. And so, as the light fades on our journey, we carry with us a sense of perspective. The towns remind us that our own lives too are brief in the vast sweep of time. What we build, what we strive for, may not last forever, but that does not make it less worthwhile. The act of building, of hoping, of trying, these are what give life its shape. Perhaps that is why ghost towns continue to hold such fascination. They whisper softly to us about our place in the world. They tell us that nothing endures forever, and yet, in the brief time we have, we leave marks that matter. Marks on the land, marks in memory, marks in the hearts of those who come after us. As you drift now toward rest, let these thoughts settle gently. The forgotten frontier towns are quiet, but their silence is not empty. It is full of history, of human striving, of the gentle reminder that impermanence is natural, and that beauty can be found in both beginnings and endings. In the hush of the present moment, let us honor them, not with noise, but with stillness, not with urgency, but with calm reflection. For in remembering these towns we also remember something of ourselves, and with that we leave the frontier behind, carrying with us the echoes of lives once lived, towns once thriving, and dreams once bright beneath wide, open skies. Now as our journey reaches its quiet end, let us pause once more in the stillness of forgotten places. The dust has long settled on their streets, the voices have faded into memory, and the wooden beams lean softly under the weight of time. And yet, as we rest here in imagination, there is no rush to leave. These towns, though empty, invite us to linger. Think of how far we have traveled. From the first steps of pioneers carving out shelter, to the fevered rise of gold and silver camps, to the gentler rhythms of farming villages and trade outposts, we have walked with them through prosperity, decline, and silence. Each town, each story was different, and yet all were bound by the same thread, the passage of time, and the human desire to create something lasting. What we find in the end is not only history, but a reflection of ourselves. We too build, dream, and hope. We too live within moments that feel solid now, but will one day soften into memory. The ghost towns are reminders, but they are also companions, silent teachers guiding us gently toward acceptance. Close your eyes for a moment, and picture the wide horizon. Beyond it lies a small town that once was. You see its outlines faintly, a church spire, a dusty road, the corner of a cabin. You hear for a heartbeat, the echo of laughter, and the rhythm of daily work. Then, like a fading dream, it softens into silence. The image blurs, the sounds drift away, and all that remains is peace. This is the gift of forgotten towns. They show us impermanence, not as something fearful, but as something natural. Just as rivers change their course, just as forests grow and fall, so too do our human settlements rise and fade. The cycle is endless, and within it there is beauty, and so we rest with them. We let the silence of ghost towns mingle with our own quiet thoughts. We allow the slow rhythm of their story to steady our own heartbeat. For in listening to their history, we are reminded that stillness is part of life, that endings carry their own calm, and that in letting go we find a kind of peace. As you drift now towards sleep, carry with you the memory of these forgotten towns, not as empty places, but as gentle landscapes where time has slowed, where silence is full, and where every ending is also a beginning. The journey is complete, the towns rest, and so may you.